Round 2. Un 13th chapter. Just like I have to release an extra video explaining why my theory is still correct after hearing this nonsense. Ugh.
So now I've explained how I think the seven novels should be interpreted and how Rose is in fact the same person as the quote-unquote witch Beatrice. I still need to explain how she got from merely personifying her guilt as a fictional servant girl to carrying out the mass murder of her family in accordance with the epitaph. But I will first jump to the end of the line and explain what I believe Rose's motive is for carrying out the murders, and then after we have that clear, we'll look back at the seventh novel in particular and the sixth novel before that in general to see how Rosa got to that point. Ironically, I believe that the culprit's motive has been in our faces the entire time throughout the first four novels. Think about it. What is the very first motive that is presented as the reason for the crime to take place? Well, throughout the first four novels, we see that Kinzo is trying to resurrect Beatrice. The ceremony is for Beatrice to come back to life to regain a human body that she had shed when she fell down a cliff 19 years earlier, as we learn in the third novel. I truly believe that this has been the culprit's true motive after all. In other words, the culprit carries out the murders since she believes carrying out the epitaph in a literal fashion will result in the resurrection of the Quadorian Beatrice. This may sound confusing since we know that Kinzo is already dead in the first place, but that only means that we need to quote-unquote translate this motive a bit. And given what we now know regarding Yasu as Rosa's quote-unquote creation, and how this character turned into the third Beatrice, coupled together with the lifelong guilt Rosa felt for killing the Quadorian Beatrice, we can in fact come to understand how this motive would be Rosa's motive. But then of course the question arises, what does any of that have to do with Battle's sin against Shannon? If we only had the first 6 novels, I don't think anyone would really object to my blue truth. But we know that an extremely important part of the reason that the murders occur revolves around Battle not coming back for Shannon. And then there is the furniture's battle for love as well. Moreover, love in general is the key subject that comes back over and over again as the driving force behind the culprit's actions.
Which is explained in my theory, I mean, not gonna lie.
So what does that have to do with Rosa believing that she can resurrect the Quadorian Beatrice? Well, actually, it has a lot to do with that. But in order to understand that, we need to take a closer look at the epitaph. But let's return to the beginning first. Let's go back to Yasu and her transformation into Beatrice. According to my fictional Yasu theory of 2 chapters ago, Rosa personified her guilt as the lowly imaginary servant Yasu. But as this, so to say, person existed through Rosa and was connected to the real world via a real servant, namely Shannon, Yasu began to develop a life of her own, so to say. Yasu soon discovered something regarding missing objects. Given the superstition of the tales of the spirits of Rokindjima, people tended to interpret inexplicably missing objects as magic. Rosa discovered if she sneakily misplaced the servant's keys, for example, especially if you used some trickery to make it seem impossible as a human prank, people would come to believe that a witch was behind it. This is what we see Yasu going through in the 7th novel, and it's already mentioned in the first couple of novels that the other servants sometimes noticed windows that were open that they thought they had locked earlier on, or how objects would suddenly turn up at different places, etc. In other words, when Rosa visited the island, all she would have to do is misplace a few items here and there, and these events would begin a life of their own, as more and more things will be interpreted as magic, even though nobody was behind them in the first place. So if you misplace something on purpose, and people will interpret it as magic, then eventually you don't even have to actively misplace things anymore, since any seemingly inexplicable accidental event will seem part of that same magic. This is how Rosa first learned about how to, quote-unquote, become a witch. If people don't understand how something is possible for humans, they can interpret it as magic. Even more important was the fact that she discussed mystery novels with Kumasawa, and later on, Shannon began to develop an interest in those books as well. And Yasu realized that if a crime truly seemed unsolvable, especially in case of closed room murders, it was as if it was no longer a mystery novel, but a fantasy novel with a witch as the culprit. Add to that the fact that Rosa and her siblings were scared into not going into the forest when they were young by tales of Beatrice, the witch of the forest. Moreover, Kinzo actually referred to Beatrice as a golden witch. The 7th novel seems to suggest that Beatrice as a witch was completely Shannon's invention and came to be from mixing stories together. In fact, Ryukisi even says this in an interview. Quote, "For Kinzo, Beatrice is a human being which might truly still exist in this world, not a witch. What turned Beatrice into a witch was not him, but rather the ghost stories told about her. It were Kumasawa and Shannon who turned her into a witch. If you exclude the fantastic depiction of her, then Kinzo's Beatrice is just pointing to a human who might be his daughter. And when he talks about his most beloved Beatrice, he means his lover and not any kind of witch. That is why the magical charms are just magical charms to Kinzo, but within Shannon it was already incorporated into the setting that the witch is weak towards magical charms. That is why for Shannon it becomes, though you are my most beloved Beatrice, you cannot enter my study." However, this is not true at all, as I can think of at least 3 instances where Kinzo referred to Beatrice as a witch. First, he called Beatrice Castiglione a golden witch, as you can see in the screenshot. And in the first novel, Battle remembers that Kinzo talked about receiving the gold from the golden witch Beatrice. And remember that this is from Battle's memory, who hasn't been on the island for 6 years. And of course, Kinzo speaks of Beatrice as a witch in the epitaph. "At the 9th twilight, the witch shall be revived, and none shall be left alive. Sleep peacefully, my most beloved witch Beatrice." So the whole tale of a witch under Rokindjima was already in existence, even that this witch was Beatrice. So this led Rosa into changing her created character from a servant into a witch. However, this witch was not yet turned into Beatrice herself. Another significant event was required for that final change to take place. But this change was already a very significant one, since this is what allowed the crimes to happen the way they did, since the notion of magic is how Rosa would eventually come to find a way to redeem herself and bring back the person she stole away from her grandfather, to resurrect Beatrice from the dead. This is also why the Yasu character goes completely out of existence, not because she began dressing up as Shannon permanently, as the official explanation would have it, but because she was a fictional character to begin with, and therefore could be changed at will by the one who created her. So how do we get from Claire to Beatrice? Well, one very crucial element is still missing, and that is something that she learned from Shannon, namely that magic in and of itself is not enough to bring about happiness. The world of magic may seem great, but it's missing a vital element. Shannon would prefer the real world over a magical one, because in the real world one can find love. And this is where Rosa found an even more of a kindred spirit in Shannon. As I said before, I believe that the term furniture refers to an extremely low social status. The reason why furniture cannot love is because of that status. Furniture is meant to serve, not to have human hopes, dreams, and fulfillment. Like Shannon is not good enough for George, and Cannon not good enough for Jessica, since they are of a much higher social status. But even though Rosa is of a high social status as a child of Kinzo, she also experiences life as furniture, and she is incapable of love as well. And that is the very important connection between Rosa and Shannon and the role of Rosa's creation, because Rosa is like furniture as well. First of all, she lost her honor by killing the Kumitoan Beatrice and had it covered up, making it a crime she got away with, which led her to lose the right of her father's love. Her biological mother died, and Rosa is the youngest of the siblings, and therefore she was looked down upon her entire life and seen as the least of the siblings, leaving her without the love of her family. And Rosa's husband ran out on her when he got her pregnant, leaving her without the love of her husband. Rosa has terrible problems getting and especially holding a new boyfriend.
I just realized something. And this has nothing to do with what's going on right now, but, you know, you think that he's got me? Oh, no, 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 no. I've got him.
Because she has Maria to take care of, leaving her without romantic love in general. Rosa has terrible problems with her relationship with Maria and frequently abuses her, leaving Rosa without the ability to give the proper love to her child. So Rosa is living life almost completely devoid of love. But then Shannon begins to acquire a glimpse of love, namely with Bella. Unfortunately for her, Bella doesn't see this the same way as Shannon does. For Bella, their time together means much less than it does to Shannon. And then Bella jokingly promises to come back for Shannon next year on a white horse to take her away from the island and her life as a servant. This is Bella's sin against Shannon, not just making this promise and not keeping it, but completely forgetting about it and not returning to the island for 6 years, while Shannon waits in anguish for Bella's return. However, Claire Beatrice, in other words Rosa, spurs Shannon on to keep believing in Bella's return, which is expressed in the magical tea time scenes between Shannon and Beatrice, and the fact that Rosa is the only person who expresses that she misses Bella and says that she hopes that he returns soon, as we can see in the following screenshot. This is actually quite telling since nobody else, apart from Shannon of course, expresses any sorrow over Bella not returning. The other people are not overly worried that Bella left, and some even see it as an opportunity for Bella, especially George, but that's because he is glad about Bella leaving, since he wants Shannon for himself. But the only people who explicitly show to miss Bella are Rosa and of course Shannon. Claire Beatrice says to Shannon that it's a test, and Bella will eventually come back for Shannon. But then after 3 years, when Bella sent everyone letters and Shannon was left out, it became clear that there had never been a promise in the first place. At this point, another radical change took place. Shannon was crossed by the fact that Bella wouldn't return to her, and this was in part Claire Beatrice's fault, as she spurred Shannon on to keep on believing. So now mere words wouldn't be enough. It was time for Claire to act. From this moment on, Beatrice became a sort of cupid of love, so to say. What I mean by that is that Beatrice's actions began to center about creating love. Her magical world missed the element of love, so she would use her magic to create it. But now, Claire had to make up for what she did to Shannon. Her first act was to provide Shannon with someone else to love her, namely to help a boy who was like a brother to her in the orphanage to a job as a servant in a mansion. This of course is Cannon, who indeed would love Shannon as a brother. I believe that Rosa pulled some strings to get this done. Remember that Rosa, being from the Ishimiya family, is still a wealthy and influential woman, so it wouldn't be that hard to pull some strings to get Cannon to a job at the mansion, as there are new servants from the orphanage every couple of years. How exactly she does this we are not shown, but a little money here and there, and the fact that many children from the orphanage get a job as a servant at the mansion at some point in their lives, and it's not difficult to imagine that Krause Netsui would see no problem in employing Cannon. And I think that there's actually a hint in the 6th novel concerning this, namely Cannon's death. When Cannon rescues Bella from the closed room with the chain, he says that he is rescuing Bella not for his sake, but to repay a debt he has to someone. But I'll come back to this issue later on. Her second act was in part symbolic, as Beatrice promised to take Shannon's burden upon herself. The sprout of love for Bella was placed from Shannon to Beatrice. What this would mean in the real world, I believe, is that Rosa would actively help Shannon find new love, which she later does by getting Shannon to pursue George instead, and that she would be the one to worry about Bella. This is where Bella's sin against Shannon started to form a connection to Rosa, but not just to Rosa as a person, but specifically to the Beatrice character. In other words, Shannon's obsession became Beatrice's obsession. From this moment on, the Beatrice character changes into the character we are familiar with, the third Beatrice, who looks the same as the Commodorian Beatrice. But the most significant change of all is that around this time, Rosa began manifesting herself as Beatrice to other people. At first only to her daughter Maria, but then also to Shannon for the first time. Remember that until that moment, Shannon had no knowledge of Beatrice outside of her dreams. At least that's how it's presented to us in the 7th novel. Shannon meets Beatrice only in her dreams, and then her memories are erased. Instead of this meaning that it only happens in Shannon's head, as in the official explanation, I think that this should be regarded from Beatrice's perspective. In other words, Rosa's perspective. It's actually in the 2nd novel where we see Shannon and Beatrice meeting for the first time. This is the first time Beatrice and Shannon meet outside of Shannon's dreams. She then gives Shannon the butterfly brooch, which represents her magical aid for establishing a relationship. Shannon accepts this and does actually become involved with George, but Cannon rejects Beatrice's help and actually defies her. Cannon defying Beatrice will become very important later on, by the way. After Rosa solved the epitaph and became the secret new head of the family, she is acknowledged as Beatrice by Genji, Kumasawa, and Dr. Nanjo as well. This is why it's crucial to not merely pay attention to the 7th novel, since that is not the full story. Especially the beginning of the 2nd novel is very important for understanding the relationship between Shannon and Beatrice, as it seems like Shannon had known Beatrice for a long time in the 7th novel, especially if you are blinded by the official explanation. Well, in the 2nd novel, we are shown that Shannon met Beatrice for the first time just before she started dating George, and Beatrice helps her getting their relationship started, which fits my theory much better than the official explanation, as Shannon had never regarded anyone as Beatrice before, or ever knew about a person named Yasu, much less actually being either one of them. Not only does Beatrice actually become present on the island and acknowledged as such by other people, but her motivations and actions all become centered around the topic of love, which is the driving force behind Rosa's Beatrice personality. After all, she learned from Shannon that even the world of magic cannot include love in and of itself. Therefore, almost all of Beatrice's magical acts are focused on generating love, replacing love, or fixing it in some way. In fact, the very concept of magic itself is linked to love as something that can only be seen through love. Without love, it cannot be seen. And now Beatrice even took upon herself the burden of Shannon's love for better. It's not that hard to imagine why Rosa would do all of this. For example, through her Beatrice persona, she is finally able to show love to her daughter. After she solved the epitaph and getting acknowledged as Beatrice by its servants and Nanjo, she is now the magical ruler of Rokkinjima at night. And being there for her father as Beatrice at the moment of his death, she was to some extent able to atone for her crimes. And she showed her superiority as a witch by using magic to create what the magical world previously lacked, namely creating love for Shannon. But this is as far as Rosa could go. The most crucial things are still missing. Even though she has solved the epitaph, the witch that revived was still weak. As we see in the beginning of the second novel, Beatrice is still weak and capable of few magical acts, but her power is rising, and when she completes her ceremony in 1986 by sacrificing the family, she will truly resurrect and regain her complete power. But as we know, the real person behind the Beatrice character has already solved the epitaph. So why is there still this issue of regaining complete magical power and resurrecting Beatrice? To understand this, we need to take a closer look at the epitaph. Rose has solved the epitaph in the symbolic way it was meant by Kinzo, but the treasures of the Golden Land didn't become hers at all, apart from gaining all the gold. But I think money means very little to Rosa. Yes, we often see her complaining about her debts, but remember that this is how she acts to her relatives. After all, those supposed debts would in part be her own fault anyway, as she shows more interest in getting into a relationship with a man than taking care of her own company. So I don't think that Rosa truly has debts, as she has 20 billion in gold, nor does she care that much about the company anyway. I think the fact that Rosa has virtually no love in her life and being a murderer in her own view is much more on Rosa's mind than how her company is doing. So, how do we get from Rosa?
This is actually just a confusing point of the theory, right? Like, if she actually does have all that gold, then why hasn't she just fixed her debt problems? You know?
Initial personification of her guilt to the mass murder of 1986, through Yasu to the first forms of Beatrice, to taking Shannon's burden of love upon herself, we arrive at...
I guess you could say that, well, she has, but she's just pretending not to have.
Epitaph. However, even after solving it, Rosa only obtained the first of the treasures that the epitaph promises, after she solved it symbolically. So why do the murders take place in accordance with the epitaph? Why, from the magical perspective, do we see Beatrice trying to bring about her own resurrection? And why do we see Kinzo having gathered his family and gambled his and their lives for the witch's resurrection ceremony? It is because that's what the culprit is after. Rosa is carrying out the epitaph in a literal fashion now to truly become a witch. As already was said in the first novel, you can only gain a lot if you're willing to risk a lot, and the outcome of such a miracle is what Kinzo calls magic. In other words, if you gain the first treasure by solving the epitaph in a symbolic way, then acting it out in a literal way may result in the rest of the treasures. As the epitaph says, the witch will praise the wise and should bestow 4 treasures. One shall be all the gold from the Golden Land. One shall be the resurrection of the souls of all the dead. One shall be even the resurrection of the lost love. One shall be to put the witch to sleep for all time. I think that Rosa believed that if she carried out the epitaph in a literal fashion, she could gain the treasures of regaining lost love for everyone and resurrecting the dead. Kinzo would revive together with his beloved Beatrice from Kurodorian, Battle Cynic and Shannon would be redeemed, perhaps even Rosa's husband would come back to her, and Maria would finally have a nice mommy again, and furniture can become worthy of love, etc. Now, whether or not Rosa truly in her heart of hearts believed that carrying out the epitaph in a literal fashion would indeed result in a miracle, I don't know. Maybe from her perspective it was truly a gamble. I guess she didn't think that she had anything else to live for anyway. Even money cannot buy the things she wanted. She had very, very little to care about in her life. So Rosa begins preparing for the murders, and her interest in mystery novels helped her plan many closed room scenarios. After all, Yasu learned that if the trick to a closed room mystery is not discovered, it can seem like something magical would have to be behind it. So in order to carry out the witch's resurrection ceremony, Rosa made several plans for carrying out murders in seemingly magical ways. These plans she would write down on pages torn from her daughter's diary and placed in the message files that were found after the murders by fishermen. But why did she do that? I think for 2 reasons. The first would be the desire to be understood, which will become important later on. And the second reason would be to turn the days of the murders into a catbox for the outside world, where the truth would be forever hidden and magical explanations could roam freely through the minds of the people of the future. After all, Rosa was planning to blow up the entire mansion, since the epitaph said that none would be left alive at the ninth twilight, which would include Rosa herself. In order to fulfill the epitaph, nobody would be allowed to leave the island alive. However, as was explained multiple times in the earlier novels, magic requires risk. If you want a truly great payoff, you need to take a lot of risk. That's why if someone would solve the epitaph, Rosa would lose her rights to claim the Umineko family as her property to use for the ceremony, and she would lose her own game. She allowed...
I don't understand this interpretation. Her solving it doesn't invalidate the epitaph murders, but someone else solving it does? Why? I mean, I technically pulled the same trick with Erica, right? But at least I, had an explanation, right? He just doesn't have an explanation here. Really. I mean, I guess it's that the ceremony wasn't powerful enough. I have to do the full ceremony. But then, if the same thing I already did happens, then the full ceremony can't happen. But that doesn't make any It doesn't make any sense.
But fate to be the determining factor. If she would win, she would win. If she would lose, she would lose. This ceremony was her gamble. But how is this connected to Bella?
Also, notice last time when he was like, oh, why would they do that? It's such an unnecessary risk. And now he's using the fact that it's a gamble as evidence for his theory. He's literally using the same kind of evidence, right, to point in two different directions. That's not allowed. It's the opposite of how it works.
It's actually not that easy to explain because there are multiple aspects to Bella's place in Beatrice's ceremony. First, she wanted someone to understand her. Since she carries Shannon's burden of love for Bella, she wanted Bella to acknowledge her as a witch. Bella's return enabled her to get George's help in carrying out the murders. And the murder mystery needs a detective. Probably one of the main desires of Beatrice is to be understood by someone. We see this issue over and over again, especially in the 7th novel. And what better person to fulfill that role than the person she is carrying the burden of love for? A very interesting red statement is one that is made by Beatrice the Younger, or Chick Beatrice, in the beginning of the 6th novel. I think that some play on words is going on here. The statement I'm referring to is the following red statement. I was born for father's sake. Beatrice the Younger is referring to Bella as her father. We are talking about Meadowvale perspective here. At that point, Bella was the new family head, the new golden witch, and the owner of the gold. In other words, the new Kinzo. So I believe that this statement basically has a double meaning, namely that it both refers to being born for Kinzo's sake and being born for Bella's sake. This is exactly what my fictional Yasu theory entails. People may find it strange to see Rosa as a lover to her own nephew, but that's because one automatically tends to assume that it's about romantic love.
But if Shannon's theory is true, they're also cousins, so it doesn't really make a big difference.
This is of course the case for Shannon, but Rosa's love for Bella is not a romantic one, I believe. Shannon is the one who had a romantic love for Bella, and Rosa merely carries it. But for her, it has a different meaning than it had for Shannon. Rosa mainly wants Bella's love in the sense of being acknowledged and understood as a person, not as a lover in a romantic sense, but to couple magic and love together as a necessary relationship, love of any sort. Yet still, Rosa can in fact act in an inappropriate fashion towards Bella, as you can see in the following screenshot from the 5th novel. The final thing that is relevant to Rosa's motivation is the furniture's love battle. Why can only one of the couples experience love? After all, if the Chicanery's explanation is false, why would that be the case? They are all separate individuals after all. However, before I can answer that, we need to understand two more things, namely the motivation
Makes sense in my theory.
of another person who is part of this group of lovers, and another aspect to the relationship between Beatrice and Shannon. So this will be explained at the end of the next chapter. As I stated before, but having to explain, is that Bella's return also enabled Rosa to carry out the ceremony, since it was the thing that needed to happen in order for her to get George to help her carry out the murders. As Claire said in the 7th novel, the murders would probably not have occurred, or at least not in the same way, if Bella had returned a year earlier or a year later. And if he hadn't returned, they might not have occurred at all. And one of the reasons why that is the case has to do with George. After all this magic stuff and reviving Beatrice has nothing to do with him. That's all about Rosa. So why would George team up with Rosa to butcher his own family in the first place? What does George have to gain from helping out Rosa? Or in other words, how did Rosa convince George to be her accomplice in murder? It is of course easy to understand that Rosa would not be capable of carrying out her ceremony all by herself. She would require some help. But in order to get someone to help her carrying out a mass murder, she would need someone with a strong motivation and determination. So let's now turn to George's motives for killing his family. When it comes to George's motivation, I will probably have a much easier time to explain it, since it's not as mysterious and strange like Rose's motivation. Basically, I can sum up George's motivation as follows. George's motive is to be with Shannon and to eliminate Butler and his family as a threat to their relationship. Before I start explaining this, let me summarize some things we know about George. He wants to be with Shannon at all costs. His relationship with Shannon would never be accepted by his family. George had his eyes on Shannon even when Shannon and Butler were quote-unquote dating. He hates Butler. He compares himself to Butler. He sees Butler as a better person than himself. He perceives Butler as a threat to his relationship with Shannon. He was happy to see Butler leave. He was worried to see Butler come back. He wants to start a new life with Shannon. He proposed to Shannon on the night before the murders occurred. He said he would be with Shannon regardless of whether his family approved of their relationship. He doesn't care about the Ishiomiya family name. He's an angry, bitter, and hurt-filled person. He was bullied, tended to hate women,
Damn, he hates his mother. Oh my god.
Also bullied by his mother, having to train for becoming the family head, enduring strict rules and relentless studies. He is hinted at to be willing to kill his family for Shannon's sake, namely in the 4th novel.
Yes.
And he's shown to have incredible willpower and determination, and is also physically strong and trained in martial arts. He knows how to kill and has the right mindset for being a successful killer. I don't think anyone would actually really dispute that these things are true regarding George. If that's the case, then it's very easy to see that George has a strong motive for joining Rosa and taking out his family in order to secure his future. There are two clips from the 5th and 6th novel in which many of these points become very clear. Let's watch those clips now. The first one is from the 5th novel.
I just couldn't imagine. Oh.
And here is a similar type of clip from the 6th novel. And here is a similar type of clip from the 6th novel.
Oh my god. I'm wondering if I should just skip this because, like, obviously, I remember this and I'm not gonna dispute this point, right? But at the same time, I feel obligated to watch the whole video. So, I'm gonna do it. As painfully pointless as it is. It is my duty. So when you say that people think George is creepy, I'm assuming you only mean people who believe in this theory and not like canonitrous believers or whatever. Because if you're a canonitrous believer, then George is just like a normal dude who's awkward about women, you know? Which, let's be frank, most of the readers of this visual novel are going to be themselves. So it's like, you know, stop throwing stones in glass houses here. But I guess if you believe this theory, then his creepiness made him, you know, an incel mass shooter or whatever. And then also, you know, because you've watched this video and these are like the two major things it points out in the video is the times where he's being most incel loserish or whatever. That stands out more in your mind as opposed to all the other stuff he does in the visual novel, which actually compromises a much larger portion of his screen time. No more. No more.
There's also another clip from the fourth game that I find really interesting. It is a mental perspective scene, so it's not objective, but if you interpret it symbolically or as a hint, it becomes very interesting. I'm talking about the moral dilemma scenario in the fourth game. Here, George is faced with three options. The first one is that he dies and everyone lives. The second is that the person he loves most dies and everyone else lives. The third option is that only the person he loves most and he himself live and everyone else dies. George goes for the third option with little hesitation. He explains that he vowed himself to Shannon, which means that he would be willing to sacrifice the world in order to be with Shannon. So even though this scene is not objective, it could tell us something about George's mindset. So in short, George probably has the right mindset for a killer. He perceives both his family and Valor as a threat to his relationship with Shannon. He doesn't care about the issue of a family name, and he wants to start a new life with Shannon. In other words, by killing his family and having mentioned blow up to wipe out all evidence and make it unclear if anyone survived at all, and with part of the cult, he and Shannon could build up a new future for themselves under new names, since they would be assumed to have died on the island. That way, nothing would threaten his relationship anymore, and George could live happily ever after with Shannon. When it comes to the connection between George and Rosa, there is very little to go on, unfortunately. However, having said that, when it comes to the accomplices of the official explanation, like Rosa in the second game and Hideyoshi in the first game, there is literally no evidence at all to any extent. So any small hint I have to connect George to Rosa is superior to the accomplices in the official explanation. So even though there aren't many things to connect George to Rosa, there are at least the following things. Both Rosa and George are shown to visit the island apart from the annual family conferences. Both Rosa and George are connected to Shannon, even regarding their love, as Beatrice helped this relationship get started. George is on the best terms with Maria, suggesting a strong connection between George and Maria than Maria has to the other family members. George is usually the one who calms Maria down. George makes some references to magic, even that his relationship with Shannon was the result of magic. So basically, the only thing that needs to be assumed is that at some point in time, Rosa actually sought George's help, knowing that he would benefit as well from taking out the entire family, and given that she would need a physically strong and determined person to help carry out the murders. But now we have George's motivation clear. Many of you, especially.
So it's too risky to get accomplices by bribing them or threatening them. But it's not risky to get an accomplice by saying, hey, you want to murder people too? How about you come help me murder people just of your own free will? The dude is off his rocker.
One who has seen my first Umineko Explained video will see what might seem like a contradiction. After all, if George wants to leave the island with Shannon, then why does Shannon get killed in all the games? Not only that, in the first game, George gets blown up in midnight together with all the other survivors. So why does that happen then? Isn't this a problem? Actually, this conflict is a very relevant and explanatory aspect of my theory, but this will be explained in the next chapter. But for now, whatever may be the reason for that, if George wanted to leave the island with Shannon, he would essentially have to fake Shannon's death or make sure she survives till the end. He might also have to fake his own death. Even as a contingency plan, it would come in handy to be able to fake his and Shannon's death if for whatever reason the bomb wouldn't go off. Even though their supposed corpses would go missing, there at least would have been witnesses who believe they have died. It can also be wise from Rosa's perspective to have the option of fake deaths available, considering that she wants to create seemingly impossible murder scenarios. But in that case, they would require the help of a doctor who can perform fake autopsies. Other people may be fooled into believing that a living person is actually dead, but a doctor would probably be difficult to fool. In other words, both Rosa and George would require her to memorize.
Also, okay, this is another annoying thing, right? I talked earlier in the last section about how, you know, they're making George seem creepier by pointing out the two creepiest scenes from him and ignoring everything else, right? And then in this, he gives the evidence for why he and Rosa would team up is that George is friendly with Maria and good at, you know, helping her calm down and stuff. But again, we're like totally ignoring the rest of George's character. The reason George is good with Maria is not because he has some special connection to Maria and Rosa. It's because he's good at conflict resolution with literally everyone. That's like his whole character. That's what we see You know, aside from when he's opening up to Shannon about the dark parts of himself, is like, that is the outer exterior nature that he carries throughout the whole game. It's not just about Maria. It's not like a small part of his character. It's fundamental to him, you know, and it's not necessarily that makes it impossible that he's the killer or whatever, right? It could easily be a faked thing. He's faked it until he's made it, you know. He actually is able to resolve conflicts, not just pretend to be on a higher moral ground or whatever. But, you know, it could still be he's only doing that for ulterior motives. But still, it's like, that's not evidence for him being close to Maria and Rosa. He does that with everyone in the same way. Maria's a bit easier to manipulate because she's younger and goes along with fantasy stuff. But he doesn't treat Maria any differently than he treats the other people. Whatever.
Because if they won't have a Nanjo on their side, they wouldn't be able to fake their deaths. However, getting someone to assist you in a murder scheme is not that easy if the person doesn't really have a motive on his own. It would be Nanjo's motive to take part in this crime. It may be obvious why George and Rosa would require Dr. Nanjo as an accomplice, but it doesn't mean that Nanjo will arbitrarily accept that offer to help out in a mass murder. Now, it's true that Nanjo himself doesn't kill anyone, but even so, he would require a strong reason for helping out a couple of murderers. The easy solution would be to state that Nanjo was bribed by Rosa, who possesses the gold. And in fact, I believe this would be the case, as this revealed in the form novel from Angie's perspective, that Dr. Nanjo's son received a ton of money since an envelope with a keycard to a vault was sent to him. However, even though
as does Ange and Kumasawa's son. Also, I believe that none of them actually use the money.
Dr. Nanjo's help was bought, it's still very plausible that he would help out murderers simply out of greed. He doesn't come across like a greedy person, and he's also a pretty old guy for whom wealth would probably be of lesser importance. In other words, if Nanjo indeed did it for the money, then he must have some good reason for needing a lot of money. He basically has to be desperate for money. So is there a hint somewhere in the story that suggests that Nanjo is indeed in need of money? Well, actually, there is almost nothing that informs us about Nanjo's motive, apart from a single hint in the third game. But that single sentence he speaks actually tells us a whole lot. He will learn something that was never mentioned before and never gets mentioned again after that. But it actually provides us with Nanjo's motive. He apparently has a sick grandchild and said that he cannot die now because of death. This may be Dr. Nanjo's motivation for helping out Rosa and George. If his grandchild has some terrible illness and needs an expensive operation that his family can't afford, then it becomes apparent why Nanjo is in need of a large sum of money. It also explains why he in particular would feel responsible, since he himself is a doctor. And Rose has the ability to offer him a lot of money, which Nanjo already knows, since he was there when she became the new head of the family. Put that together with the fact that Nanjo is not part of the Yoshiomiya family himself, and would most likely value his own family's well-being over the well-being of the Yoshiomiya family, and I think...
Also, how are you gonna be like, Liam, you can't use money as your motive, and then just let him use money as his motive? Whatever.
Nanjo's motive for helping Rosa and George. However, as I stated in Red, Dr. Nanjo is not a killer. He doesn't kill anyone. He only helps out setting up the murder scenarios.
Also, and you're like, oh, but it's for another purpose of saving his sick grandchild. I also gave other purposes for the characters I listed as culprits in my theory, right? For Ava and Hideyoshi, it's to separate George from Shannon, right? For Rosa, it's to bring her closer to Maria, right? I gave other reasons, but whatever.
We never actually kill anyone for Rosa and George's sake. So, there you have it, the two culprits and their accomplice. We have the whodunit and the why not of the story clear, apart from one other aspect that I will need to discuss in the next chapter. But before I then go into that, there are still some things I need to deal with. So let's first talk about the position of the servants. Contrary to the official explanation, I don't believe that any of the servants are accomplices. Moreover, all scenarios can be explained without them being accomplices, contrary to the official explanation. However, I do think that the servants are involved in some sense, but not in the sense of actively helping out the culprits like Nanjo is. When it comes to Genji, I believe that he probably knows what is going on, but simply lets it happen. We know that Genji's personality is almost like that of a robot, and he's extremely loyal to the family head, which would be Rosa. So I think his attitude can be summed up in what he says in the servants room scenario in the second game, that the fate of furniture is determined by the family. So even though he doesn't actively help out Rosa and George, he stands by passively and let everything run its course. I also believe that if Rosa would ask Genji to do something like, I want you to unlock Natsui's room or leave the front door unlocked, then he would basically do that without question, especially if it happens before any murders occur. When it comes to Shannon, I believe her attitude is summed up by the mental perspective of the second game and third game. She already feels complete and has received more than somewhat of the status of furniture deserves. So whatever happens, happens. Whether she fully realizes what is going on, I don't know, but she definitely doesn't know about George's involvement. But she does know, of course, that Rosa is the family head and Beatrice. When it comes to Kumasawa, you would basically expect her to be an accomplice, because just like Nanjo, her family received money. But there's not a single scenario in which her involvement is required. Sure, there are some scenarios in which she could suppose her involvement, but the point is that those scenarios can just not be explained better. Also, I think that given her age, she wouldn't care about money in the first place. So saying that she was bribed is not a very strong explanation in my opinion.
Given her age, she wouldn't care about money, even though the money's going to her family. Like, no one cares about giving money to their kids or grandkids. Obviously false, incredibly false if you look at human reality, and also directly contradictory to the motives you gave Nanjo, since his money is also going to his child and or saving his sick grandchild, not for his own, personal spending.
So I will take arbitration approach and simply shade away the necessary assumption of Kumasawa being involved. I think that the fact that the family received money has a different explanation than a bribe. Given the fact that it was Kumasawa who took care of Koitori and Beatrice for her entire life, and the fact that Kumasawa was regarded as a sort of mother by Yasu, I think that Rosa provided Kumasawa's family with money out of gratitude. Something like, you took care of Kizu's child, now I will take care of your children. Which is actually quite disturbing when you really think about it. Canon is quite a different story, however. Instead of quote-unquote helping the culprits by being passive or simply oblivious, Canon's attitude is quite the contrary from the medical perspective. Canon actually goes against Beatrice on multiple occasions. He doesn't accept Beatrice's help to bring him and Jessica together, and smashes the butterfly brooch. He fights against Beatrice's demons in both the second and the third game. He helps the survivors escape in the fourth game, and there's a very interesting situation on the boiler room in the first game, where he says that he will bring about Beatrice's resurrection by, in his words, being the zero on her roulette. In other words, Canon is Beatrice's enemy and actively goes against her on multiple occasions. Canon doesn't come across as a cold-blooded killer at all, which is what he would be given the official explanation, but instead he's shown to be willing to sacrifice himself if necessary. Just keep this in the back of your head for now. When it comes to Koda, he's the most oblivious person on the island, who has no idea what is going on and doesn't even know about Kizu's death. But there are two instances where he is directly forced to lie for the culprits, and then is isolated from battle afterwards. This happened in the second and in the fourth game, and will be explained in detail in Chapter 8. So now I'm done with everyone's motives, but as I said before, there's still a problem with the conflict between Rose and George's motives, and the issue of Fern's battle for love, in which only one of the couples will be able to experience love. And then there's also a different motive in the fifth game, in which someone is trying to fame Matsui. So what's that all about? So let's move on to the next chapter, in which I will put forth what I call the betrayal theories and scapegoat theory. The betrayal theories I'm going to present in this chapter are not merely something I made up in order to explain the apparent conflict between the motives of culprits and the role of Shannon and to a lesser extent Canon. This is actually something that the story calls for, and is something that gets pretty much ignored in the official explanation. Even in interviews, I've seen pretty much no account for this, and to what minimum extent it is discussed, it's accounted for in a very weak and unconvincing fashion. The main thing I'm talking about here is the relationship between Beatrice and Shannon, and how it vastly differs in the first four novels, especially the second and third novels, compared to the seventh novel and the recently released Umineko Confession. After all, Beatrice is basically Shannon's friend in the seventh novel, and pretty much also in Umineko Confession, and Shannon is very sympathetic towards Beatrice as well in there. Now the relationship does start off that way as well in the second novel, but when the days of the murders arrive, this has changed radically. Beatrice is now Shannon's worst enemy and betrays her in the most sadistic kind of way. She basically helped her to get together with George, and now she's finally tearing apart the relationship again. This is not really accounted for in the official explanation, and it's hardly mentioned in interviews. Basically, a sort of generalized explanation would be that it symbolizes an inner conflict within Shannon. In other words, that there is a sort of struggle going on inside Shannon regarding her personalities and their lovers. Basically, Shannon doesn't know who to choose, Jessica, George, or Bella. But isn't really what we see in the second and third novels? Do the scenes in which we see Beatrice and Shannon and Canon interact really symbolize an inner struggle? It seems like a very weak explanation in my opinion, because what we see is not merely some sort of struggle. What we see is outright betrayal, horrible, cruel, and sadistic betrayal towards Shannon and Canon on Beatrice's part. Let's take a look at some clips of Beatrice and Shannon interacting, and take note of Beatrice's incredible cruelty in these scenes. そなたの恋路を助けたのはわらわの単なるいたずら心。いかにして個人でねじり破綻するかを解消するためにまいた種に過ぎる。あなたは人をいじめ迷わず困らせてそれを私に糧にしている。だからあなたに抵抗する唯一の方法はこれだと確信した。なんであなたには知らない。私の運命を全うする。だからあなたを面白がらせたりしない。それがあなたに唯一できる私の抵抗です。あなたが用のあるなら他のものをさせますので。面白い。殺して。
Again, this makes perfect sense in my theory. No need. In the beginning of the second novel, we see how Beatrice introduces herself to Shannon, and then basically becomes her friend and guardian, and helps her get into a relationship with George. And then we see how she tears this relationship apart again for her own personal gain. This is pure and utter betrayal on Beatrice's part. Does Shannon's inner struggle really account for this in a reasonable way? Or should this really be regarded as betrayal, as is the case in my theory? After all, this betrayal is exactly what is to be expected, given that Rose is Beatrice and the main culprit who is trying to carry out the epitaph in a literal fashion. She did set up Shannon's and George's relationship, but now she needs everyone, including them, as sacrifices for a ritual. After all, on the ninth twilight, the witch shall revive, and none shall be left alive. No one is allowed to survive, not even Rosa herself. In other words, in order to complete the ceremony, Rosa needs to betray Shannon and George, and make sure that both of them die that night, even though George helped her in order that he and Shannon can start a new life together. When it comes to George, he wants to use the bomb to obscure the fact that he and Shannon are still alive, but Rosa wants to use the bomb in order to make sure that nobody will survive. So I believe that when Rosa informed George about the bomb, she conveniently left out the fact that when the bomb is armed, then it goes off at exactly 12 o'clock. That's why George blows up together with everyone else at the end of the first game, because even though he knows about the bomb, he doesn't know that it will go off at 12 o'clock, since Rosa lied about how the mechanism truly works. She could for example have said that it goes off at 6 in the morning, or after a certain amount of hours have passed, or whatever it may have been. This way, Rosa can make sure that no matter what happens, everyone will certainly die, even George. Now, a possible objection might be that George would have to be pretty stupid to fall for such a trick, but I don't see how George really would have had any other option. After all, it would have been impossible for him to test out when the bomb actually does go off after it's armed. Moreover, Rosa obviously wouldn't have told him that she planned to kill him and Shannon as well. And probably the most important thing, I don't think that George's plan was to leave Rosa alive either. So betrayal would go both ways in the first place. George probably would have killed Rosa when everything was over. After all, it's not really smart to leave a witness behind, now is it? But apart from the bomb, I believe Rosa has another way to make sure that George and Shannon truly die. After all, if George is going to fake Shannon's death, his own death, or both, then it would be wise on Rosa's part to sabotage this faking of death in some way. Erica explains in the fifth game that faking death using a drug doesn't violate Knox's first rule, because there are many known drugs that can induce fake death. And since fake death drugs are necessitated in the fifth game, since it's pretty obvious that the victims of the first one were only killed after they moved, since the rest proves that they were never moved after the deaths. So we know that fake death drugs are available to the culprit. But is there also evidence that the culprit has poison available? Well, yes, there is. Namely, at the end of the fourth game, Bella finds Maria dead without any external wounds, and when he closely examines her mouth, he notices traces of white foam on her lips, which suggests that she was poisoned. In other words, the culprit has both fake death drugs and poison available. So if Rosa wanted to sabotage the faking of George's and Shannon's death, then she had the means for doing so. All she had to do is prepare two versions of the fake death drug, a real one for herself and a poisoned one for George, so that if he used it on himself and or Shannon, it would result in real death rather than fake.
The drug itself would probably have been provided by Fernando, since he's a doctor, and therefore would easily have access to drugs that can induce fake death. But what exact scenarios the fake death drug and poison apply, I will explain when I get to those scenarios in chapter 8. But there is another side to the betrayal theory. After all, Beatrice herself gets betrayed as well in both the third game and in the fifth game. In these games, the epitaph is solved, resulting in Rosa's loss. This was the only way that Beatrice could be stopped, yet in both cases, the murders continued despite the epitaph being solved. In both cases, from the magical perspective, Beatrice's role changes dramatically. In the third game, Beatrice basically gets replaced by evil Beatrice, and Rosa is killed. In the fifth game, the epitaph is solved before any murders occur, and this game is not even regarded as Beatrice's game. She is neither the game master, nor is she depicted as the culprit in the magical perspective. So, why does this happen? The official explanation doesn't include who the culprit is supposed to be in the fifth game, and the government explanation for the third game is that Eva is the culprit for most of the game, and or that Chicanan wasn't truly dead in the 6th game closure scenario, which I already proved to be impossible. However, I don't need to invoke any extra people in order to explain the third and fifth game. I can explain both games with George as the culprit. Because as I said, the betrayal theory works both ways. Rosa doesn't care about George's motives, but neither does George care for Rosa's motives. In other words, George wants his family dead in order to start a new life with Shannon, so the epitaph being solved is of no concern to George. However, it would be quite difficult for George to commit all the crimes on his own. Now, in the third game, he has no choice since he's already past the point of no return, but in the fifth game, it's a different story since the epitaph gets solved before the first twilight. Since it's a problem for George that the epitaph gets solved, since he would lose his fellow culprit, it is very plausible that he would have a better plan in case this would happen. Now, a couple of factors are relevant for George to take into consideration. He could expect retaliation from Rosa. Rosa holds the key to the underground VIP room. Shannon knows nothing about his plan.
It just doesn't really make sense as a motive for George. It really just doesn't make sense. Because his whole thing is like, if my family stands against me, right, I'll kill them. But now he's killing them before he knows if they're standing against him. And on top of that, he's killing people who have no reason to stand against him, right? He's killing Maria. You know. Why? He's killing Jessica. Why? You know, why kill Kyrie and Rudolph? What are they going to do about George dating Shannon? Right? Really, the only plausible people that he has to worry about are Ava and Hideyoshi, right? Imagine if he had, and it's even weirder because they end up being some of the last ones to get killed most of the time. And in fact, Ava ends up alive in the third game. The one where he's the supposed culprit, right? Is the one where his primary enemy is the only one who survives. Like, he managed to be so good that he killed literally everyone, except the one person he needed to kill. Like, it's just pretty... It's kind of nonsensical, is all I'm saying. And if you imagine that he just killed Ava and Hideyoshi in a more direct way, right? He would have been less suspicious because it would be like, why'd he kill his parents? You know, that's so messed up. And he also could have easily done it in a way that casts blame on some of the other siblings, right? Because the siblings are known to have this squabble over the inheritance, right? So he could have solved his issue in a much easier way that also would have cast less suspicion on him and not required like having to fake his and Shannon's deaths and all this. It just doesn't make sense.
And killing everyone might not be feasible. It might seem like the easiest thing would be to arm the bomb in secret and then make sure that everyone apart from Shannon and himself die in the explosion. But that would be a very difficult plan that would easily fail since Shannon knows nothing about his plan and Rosa would be in his way. So I would imagine that he still would try to get everyone killed.
That would be an easy plan though, because again, killing just Rosa is way easier than killing everyone else. Again, it's like, it doesn't make sense. It really doesn't make sense.
Doing that by himself might not be feasible. So if it may not be feasible to take out his entire family, he should at least try to aim at disrupting the Shimiya family in some way. The best way to do this is to aim at taking out Christ and Sui, since that would result in all servants losing their jobs as servants in the mansion. Then fake his own death to get away from his mother and the rest of the family, and if possible, try to get rid of Beppo in some way as well. Now all of this fits with the culprit's actions in the fifth game. After all, Kraus gets killed and Sui gets framed for murder. And Sui would definitely be suspected for the murder in the guest room in the mansion, but if it hadn't been for Erica, Bella would probably have taken the fall of the scenario in the cousin's room in the guest house. George was among the victims of the first Twilight, and as we know, all the deaths were faked at that point in time, including George, and Rosa was among those victims as well. However, we know that everyone still dies at the end because of the bomb, so we know that something went wrong. And I'll explain.
He's interpreting it as all the people who saw the bodies before Erica entered just thought that they were dead? Okay. Alright.
And later, why George actually faked the deaths of the victims of the first wild instead of just faking his own death. After all, he wasn't planning to leave any of them alive, so why not just kill the other 5 and only fake his own death? I'll explain that in the next chapter. But despite it in the end something went wrong, George would have succeeded in his plan. Krause would be dead, and Sue and Bethel would go to jail for murder, meaning that Shannon would no longer be in service of the Umineko family, and Rosa Maria would be dead. Eva lost her husband, although George probably didn't plan on killing his father, he just happened to be the one who entered the guest room, and George would be believed to be dead. The Umineko family would be in shambles, and Shannon would be quote-unquote free, and George would be believed to be dead, meaning that he can now try to start a new life with Shannon. And since Rosa's dead, he would now have access to the underground VIP room to make sure that he takes a bit of gold with him. Now, in case he wouldn't be able to set up the bomb, everything would still work out, but there would be the problem of his corpse going missing. If only his own corpse would go missing, that would be rather suspicious, so it would be a smart move to make sure that multiple corpses go missing, so that there will be no special attention to his particular disappearance. Now, the final issue is about how George would frame Matsui, and here I have to make an assumption that I cannot necessarily prove, but it's a reasonable assumption given that Rosa and George together are culprits, and that's the following. George knows about the Yasu character, and especially how it originated, or at the very least, he knows about the baby that died after it fell from the cliff 90 years ago, and the fact that it was placed into Matsui's care. It's not really necessary that George knows about Yasu, but at minimum, George would need to have heard about the baby who died from Rosa, who was still living at the mansion at the time. I can't prove that Rosa told George about that, but I don't think it's an unreasonable assumption, because if she did, all pieces to the puzzle of the 5th game fall into place. I would expect that Rosa and George didn't plan this murder scheme during a one-time meeting or something. I take it that George knows to some extent of Rosa's past and her motives. So that's the scapegoat theory, which only became actual in the 5th game. So now we have this theory clear, I'll explain the 5th game in detail in the next chapter. So now we have finally all the information we need to understand the furniture love battle without this canon trees explanation. So what does any of this have to do with the issue of furniture with incomplete souls and a battle for love in which only one of the couples can experience love and the others cannot? In the official explanation, this is because Shannon, Canon, and Beatrice are in fact the same person, and therefore she can ultimately be with only one of them. But Canon is actually explained in a different way. Let's analyze this a bit. We have 3 groups: Beatrice, or in other words Rosa, and Bella, Shannon and George, and Canon and Jessica. The connection between Rosa and Bella can only be fulfilled if Rosa succeeds in a plan. But if Rosa wins, then the other 2 groups can't possibly be together. After all, they would die if Rosa wins. Shannon and George can only be together if George succeeds in his plan. But he wants everyone apart from Shannon and himself dead as well, especially Bella. Also, Rosa wants George dead, meaning that George can only survive if he kills Rosa. So if George wins, then only he and Shannon will be left alive, meaning that the other 2 groups cannot be together. Canon and Jessica are both innocent, so they can only be together if both Rosa and George are stopped, meaning that they would either have to be killed or have to be found out and contained so that they can be arrested. This implies that if Jessica and Canon can be together, the other 2 groups would either have to die.
I mean, I guess you could interpret it that way. I mean, it's not true because we haven't actually shown for a fact that George and Shannon can't be together if George doesn't kill everyone. You know, that just hasn't been proven. That's an assumption that you and George are operating on, but it is an incredibly unlikely assumption, to say the least. And then this stuff is just a bit nonsense, but whatever.
Or be separated. So that's what I believe furniture love battle is about. The incompleteness of their souls has nothing to do with being the same person, it's simply that they are incomplete because they are missing love. After all, there is the theme of love being the most important element in the world. Through love, Shannon can see that the ocean is blue, but without love, it cannot be seen. So what makes a person so complete is to love and be loved in return. It has nothing to do with Shannon, Canon, and Beatrice being personalities of the same human being. Now, the most interesting part regarding the furniture love battle, something that fits very well with my theory, but it's hard to explain if you believe in the official explanation, namely, why it is that Shannon wins, given that this love battle happens in the 6th game. After all, if you believe the official explanation, then all people involved in the love battle are still alive. So in what sense did Shannon actually win? However, this can easily be accounted for, given my theory. After all, if my explanation of the 6th game is correct, then Rosa was decapitated by Erica, and Canon was shot to death by Erica in a closet, meaning that the only group in which both people are alive consists of George and Shannon. That's what I believe is the reason that Shannon won the love battle, because she and George both survived, while Canon and Rosa didn't. I can even account for why at the end, Beatrice and Bella still end up together, since Beatrice did save Bella from his closed room through Canon. Let's take a look at what Canon says exactly. Saw that Canon said that he was paying back a debt, and that this debt was not to Bella. I explained that I believe that this refers to the fact that it was Rosa who pulled the strings necessary to get Canon employed at the Umineko mansion, and therefore be reunited with Shannon, who was very important to her when they both lived in the orphanage. In other words, Canon sacrificed himself for Rosa's sake, meaning that Rosa essentially rescued Bella post-mortem through Canon's sacrifice. Remember that no actual murders have taken place here apart from Erica's killings, so in this timeline, Rosa is not an actual murderer, basically because Erica got in the way. So this way, the furniture love battle can be accounted for without this Canon trees explanation. So now let's try together, but yeah.
That doesn't really make much sense. I guess I don't really currently have a better explanation as to why Canon would say that, though. Does anyone have a good explanation as to why Canon would say that? I'm assuming no. If you know of any other explanations, I'd be interested to hear them.
To set about Genji and Nanjo about being furniture. Right now, you should be able to interpret the scene apart from the official explanation as something that could be said by Rose's fictional creation. So let's take a look at the screenshot again. Why did you say to me refers to Genji keeping Rose's involvement in the Courtorian Beatrice's death a secret? Since Nanjo and Genji were the ones taking care of all the issues surrounding getting rid of Beatrice's corpse, who was a person kept by Genji in secret, it is probable that Nanjo knew about what really happened as well. After all, the Courtorian Beatrice was a person who wasn't supposed to exist and didn't officially exist to the outside world. Why didn't you let me die essentially means, why didn't you force me to face the consequences of my actions so I could deal with them, instead of keeping her guilt hidden within herself? The terrible injury refers to the emotional wounds of the guilt that Rosa was forced to bear and had to be dealt with by personifying it as Yasu. So the body that is referred to here is the fictional servant body of Yasu. Yasu's body not even being capable of love and being less than human and being like furniture instead refers to Yasu's honor status of furniture, as I've explained before, and furniture is simply not worthy of love. Now, one more thing I need to say about my betrayal theory is that both Rose and George are not willing to let Dr. Nanjo leave the island alive. Fortunately for him, the key card to retrieve the money was already on its way to his son. But what is unfortunate is that his son never collected the money, so we never learned what happened to the granddaughter. One must wonder, however, why Nanjo's son never collected the money if he needed it for his daughter. But it's of course not at all likely that he lied to Angie about leaving the money behind for pretty obvious reasons, if you ask me. After all, would you admit to a stranger that you basically took a large sum of basically dirty money? So now I'm done with the who done it and why done it story. We can now finally move on to the how done it, and I will start by explaining the fifth game in detail. Suri received a phone call from the man of 19 years ago. This is a very short phone call which scares Suri, but if you wouldn't call back, she would probably just remember it as some sick sort of prank. This happens before the days of the murders, so it would be safe to assume that this actually happened before any of the games. After all, in the other games, we don't really know what happened to Suri before the days of the murders. However, in the first four games, George didn't have to give Natsui another phone call, since everything went according to plan. But in the fifth game timeline, the act was solved before the first murders, meaning that George now had to set his backup plan into motion. The first thing that disrupts Rose's and George's plan in the fifth game is that around the time Rosa was about to hand the first letter to Maria as Beatrice, Maria is confronted by Erica Fruto. Because of this, the evening goes quite different as planned, and extra attention is paid to the epitaph because of Erica's interest in the riddle. After the family decided to go to bed, Rosa stayed behind with Bella to do the dishes, and they discussed the epitaph together. Rosa in fact provides Bella with a hint to solve the epitaph. A short while later, Erica and Bella solved the epitaph, meaning that Rosa lost her gamble. But I actually think she was very much relieved by this result, especially given that it was Bella who solved the epitaph instead of anybody else. Rosa is like one of the serial killers leaving behind hints for the police because they essentially want to be stopped. In fact, that would be a pretty good description of how Rosa is as a killer. In fact, it's even part of the official explanation that Beatrice has some sort of desire to get caught. Moreover, Rosa is pretty upset that Natsui and Kraus tried to deny Bethel the right to the family headship. In fact, it was Rosa who challenged Natsui to go ask Ginzo about whether or not Bethel should be the new head. Of course, knowing that Natsui cannot do so since Rosa was there when Ginzo died. Even more, she decided to officially make Bethel the new family head by giving him Ginzo's ring through an act of Beatrice's magic. Given that she herself would be present at the conference, she endorsed the deliver this letter in a magical fashion. So here we are at the first major riddle of the fifth game, namely the letter in the hallway and the knock on the door. This was actually a rather difficult riddle in which almost no options were left available due to the many red statements concerning the scenario. So my take on this riddle was essentially purely deductive in order to find out what would be possible in the first place. When I discovered the possibility that was allowed by the red statements, I first thought that the solution to this riddle was not hinted at any place in the story. But when I reread the seventh novel, I actually saw my solution hinted at in the beginning of the seventh novel by Will, even though he was talking about an unrelated case. Nevertheless, here in this screenshot, you see the solution to the riddle of the letter and the mysterious knocking sound. Like many riddles in Umineko, time is a crucial factor, and so it is in this scenario. The illusion is that it seems like the knocking sound in the letter appear exactly at midnight, because the clock in the hallway sounds from midnight. However, it actually is already past midnight when the course bell rings, and we can slip past the red concerning what could or could not have happened exactly 24 hours. After all, the red is the absolute truth, so when the red says at 24 hours, it's about the real time 24 hours. But if the clock only rang from midnight at, let's say, 50 minutes past midnight, then there is a possible way for someone to knock on the door and place the letter there. Now, who could have placed the letter there and knock on the door? Well, the red proves that nobody in the dining hall could have been this person, regardless of time. Since the red is specific about the people in the dining hall and not merely just the time. Also, that Sui, Kraus, and Genji are proven to not have knocked or placed the letter there in red, also in spite of the time. That means that the only possible candidates are the people who are outside of the mention as 24 hours real time, which are Koda, Kusawa, Nanjo, Erica, Jessica, Maria, and George. Now I think we would all agree that it couldn't have been Erica, and also remember that the envelope contains Ginzo's ring, which would have been in Beatrice's possession. But Kumasawa is shown in red to have gone to bed and stayed there until morning, so she couldn't have done it. And Erica left the cousin's room at midnight and then was with Nanjo the whole time, so neither of them could have done it either. When it comes to Goda, we know that he's probably the most innocent person on the island, so he's basically one of the most unlikely suspects. Goda has no connection to the culprit or even knows that Ginzo was dead. This is even true given the official explanation. So I think he's the most unlikely candidate. Moreover, we know that between the time that Goda entered the guest house and the time that he went back to the lounge at 1 a.m., where he talked with Nanjo and Erica until 3 a.m., Erica had sealed the room Goda was in. In other words, Goda couldn't have left the servant's room until he was called out by Erica at 1 a.m. when Rosa arrived at the guest house. So that proves that Goda is innocent. So the leads in the official explanation have only one option to have someone with Shen's accomplice deliver Ginzo's ring inside the envelope in the dining hall, and that would be by appealing to Nanjo as the person who placed the envelope there. Of course, if that works, it would work for my theory just as well, since Nanjo is an accomplice in my theory too. However, the problem is that Nanjo met up with Erica at exactly 24 hours, and then stayed with her until 3 a.m. So you would have to say that the clock chimed from midnight, not after midnight at the light passed, but before it. But then you run into problems concerning the order of events. However, I don't think that beliefs in the official explanation really have another option. The problem with the order of events is that the red proves that at 24 hours real time, Natsui was still in the corridor of the second floor and not in a room answering the phone, which happened quite a short time after the clock in the hallway chimed from midnight. Now this is not a checkmate per se, since the scene in which Natsui goes answering the phone is not observed by Erica, but you will have to do some intellectual evidence to make Nanjo delivering the letter before midnight fit, while there are no problems with someone from the cousin's room placing the letter after midnight in real time. So we are left with three people in the cousin's room. Either Jessica, Maria, or George was the one to knock on the door and place the letter in the hallway after midnight in real time. Now again, Jessica is unlikely as well, since she's almost as innocent as Goda, apart from that she knows that Ginzo was dead. And Maria truly believes in Beatrice, so taking part in the trick to make the appearance of a letter seems magical is quite unlikely as well. So even though it's not the absolute single possible explanation, but I would say without hesitation that the most probable candidate would be George, and that's exactly what I believe. So Rosa gave the letter with Ginzo's ring to George, and had him set up a seemingly magical scenario in which Beatrice handed over the family headship to Bethel by means of a magically appearing letter and a knock on the door exactly at midnight. At least it would seem like that. Because it may not have been feasible for George to be in front of the dining hall door at exactly midnight, which would have been preferable for dramatic effect to knock on the door exactly at midnight. You know, midnight, ghost hour, magic, blah.
This explanation is in some ways simpler and better than mine. but also runs into the same exact issue, which is that George has no motive, right, to knock on the door at what seems to be midnight but isn't actually midnight, right? Because he does not exist in the meta world where the red text exists and yada yada. So, like, this is another way to do it that's perhaps better, but it doesn't solve the issue of it being fundamentally nonsensical from a character motivation perspective.
What? So it would be smarter to set the arms of the clock back a bit to give him more time. Then when he made it from the guest house to the dining hall door, he could simply move the arms of the clock forward to 12 o'clock, and then knock on the door, leave the ladder there, and get out again. This explanation is consistent with all of that statements. There is no conflict. The only possible objection I can think of is that the dimension was supposed to be locked, meaning that George could not have entered. But of course, we have no objective evidence that all doors and windows truly were locked. This is not stated in red, so it's an unprovable objection. People assume that all doors were locked, but we cannot be sure about that. Also, since it was Rose's plan to begin with, she could have ordered Genji to keep the door or window unlocked, and given Genji's unusual loyalty, he would have done that without asking questions. Also, asking to open a window is not really that much to ask for a servant. Also, Rose could have done it herself, so that's a pretty easy problem to solve. Another sort of objection could be that it would be rather strange for George to go along with Rose's plan. Now, the appetite was solved, meaning that Rosa wouldn't want to go through with the murders. So why would George help out Rosa with magically delivering Beatrice's letter to Bella? But actually, this is exactly what George needed in order to carry out his backup plan. Also, since this letter scenario would have been thought of very quickly after it was announced that the appetite was solved, this would put George in a position to make certain demands. For example, that Rosa would make sure that she would leave the conference before anyone else and meet up with George in the guest house. But before that, he needed to make another phone call to Matsui. Now here we are put in a rather confusing position as real, since because of the way the story is told, we jump back and forth in time. But this would have to be the order of events. George entered the mansion at around midnight, but at least a bit after midnight. George went into Matsui's room and then hit the tarot card with the Kenji for a fall on it behind the clock. George went to whatever room where her phone was in order to make a call to Matsui. Kenji would pick up his phone and then went to inform Matsui that it was a phone call for her. George used his time to get to the dining hall door, set the arms of the clock to strike for midnight, and knocked twice on the door and left the envelope there. He quickly went back to the room he made the phone call from, and a couple of minutes later Matsui picked up the phone and he had a conversation. This way everything adds up and there are no inconsistencies. I see only three possible objections. The first would be to say that George could not have entered Matsui's room since it was probably locked. But I have two things to say about that. One, we have no objective evidence that the door was locked. And two, it is at least implied that it wasn't locked. When Matsui entered the room to answer the phone, it specifically mentioned that she locked her room. She thinks that no one would expect that to be odd, since it wasn't that unusual for her to lock her room. That sort of implies that she doesn't always have her room locked, only that it's not unusual for her to lock her room. But that implies that she doesn't always lock her room. It's also not mentioned that she had to first unlock her room to get inside, only that she locked it when she was inside. However, it's depicted to see when Matsui is hiding in the closet where she says that her room is always locked, even though in the scene where she goes to answer the phone, she only says that it's not unusual for her to lock her door. So it's kind of hard to tell whether the door was locked or not. At the very least, there's no red truth proving that it was locked, so there's always the possibility that it wasn't locked for whatever reason, even something like that Matsui happened to forget to lock it. But anyway, let's think of an alternative explanation then, of how George would have been able to enter Matsui's room. And this is where Rose might come in. After all, Rose has control over especially Kenji since he's the true head of the family. So if she told Genji to leave Matsui's room unlocked, he would probably have done that without asking questions. All George needed to do is demand that Rose had this arranged, or he would not deliver the letter. Since there was very little time available after the appetite was solved for Rose to arrange that George would deliver the letter at the dining hall, Rose would have little time to argue about any demands George would make. So George could even get away without explaining why on earth he wanted Matsui's room unlocked in the first place. Rose wouldn't really have any options if she wanted to miss what appeared in that scenario. Essentially, the only real problem I have with the fifth game is this issue of Matsui's room being locked. It's the only flaw in my theory regarding the fifth novel. But as I demonstrated, there is no objective evidence that demonstrates that Matsui's room is locked. And there are ways to explain how George could have entered Matsui's room even if it was locked. Furthermore, the windows in Matsui's room are not even mentioned throughout the entire fifth novel, as far as I'm aware of. So if a window had been open, then that could have been a way for George to enter the room. In which case it would become irrelevant whether the door was locked or not. So even though this first objection isn't a bit of a problem, it can be solved in multiple ways. The second objection would be that it is mentioned that it's 7 past midnight on Matsui's clock. So that seems to contradict my theory that the clock in the hallway gave the wrong time. However, if George had entered Matsui's room, then I suppose he would be smart enough to change the time on Matsui's clock as well. Otherwise, he would probably...
Again, why would he do this? There's no reason for him to do this. I mean, again, it's an issue for my theory as well, right? But at least I explained it in the meta world, right? I gave a reason for it to be happening, even if it's a funny reason. He's just like pretending that this isn't even an issue.
We have noticed the inconsistency. The third objection would be that George could not have known that Matsui's favorite season was fall. After all, there's the following red truth that Matsui stated later in the game. I never told anyone except Shannon that I like fall. I believe that this statement is there to support the Shigenu's deception, not because it's actually relevant. I will explain in a minute why it would be impossible for Shannon or Canon to have made a phone call to Matsui. But anyway, there are two ways to account for the tarot card. First, there is the possibility that he heard it from Shannon that fall is Matsui's favorite season. He is her boyfriend after all, so it might come up in conversation. The red only proves that Matsui told nobody except Shannon what her favorite season was, but it says nothing about whether or not Shannon told it to anyone else. But even simpler, George didn't actually have to know what Matsui's favorite season was. After all, he didn't just tell her what her favorite season was. Matsui said it herself that fall was her favorite season, and then George pretended that he knew it all along, and the card was meant to deceive her into believing that he indeed did know that. But this is a very transparent magic trick. All George had to do is to hide 4 different cards in Matsui's room in 4 different places, one for each season. Then he simply had to guide Matsui towards the location where the card was hidden, with the kanji on it for the season that Matsui would mention as her favorite season. So as far as I'm aware, there are no inconsistencies with my theory. As since any theory would have to include the fact that the person on the phone can twist their voice so that Matsui won't recognize who it actually is, there is no problem for it being George. Since that would be a problem for George, it would be a problem for literally everybody. So that would be an unreasonable objection. Now I want to put forth yet another problem for believers in the official explanation, namely that it would be impossible for Shannon or Canon to have made the phone calls to Matsui, because Shannon and Canon were in the dining hall at 24 hours and remained there until at least 1 a.m. In other words, whoever made the phone calls to Matsui, it couldn't have been Shannon or Canon. And the same problem applies when Matsui is called in the morning, because Canon and Goten knock on the door when she's still on the phone. So believers in the official explanation would basically have to believe that it was Genji who called Matsui. I will let you all determine for yourselves how likely you think that explanation would be. When it comes to what happens after this, things are not overly clear. In fact, things become very ambiguous. At this point, the culprit would have to have gone after Genji and Kraus, but we don't really know where they are located at what point in time. What we see is that Kraus and Genji go to the dining hall. However, the red truth states concerning Genji. When Genji finished transferring the call, he immediately returned to the waiting room. So that would mean that he couldn't have gone to the dining hall. So basically, I can present the following blue truth. There is no objective evidence available to establish Krause's location as of midnight. So I believe the following, another blue truth. The culprit attacked Genji in the waiting room somewhere after the finishing of the phone call and before 1 a.m. He then faked Genji's death using a fake death drug and fake blood. According to the truth, he was sealed to the waiting room at 1 a.m. and never checked inside the room, meaning that the unconscious Genji was discovered and believed to be dead by Ken and Kumasawa the following morning when they broke the seals. And concerning Krause, the culprit attacked Krause at an undetermined location in the mansion at some point before 1 a.m. There was no evidence of what state Krause was in from that point on, but it can be assumed that he was tied up and unconscious. The culprit then left Krause behind and returned to the following morning. Right after Sui received another phone call, the culprit killed Krause. Since the best shows his corpse was never moved after his death, the blood traces in his room were fake blood. And then concerning George himself, George the culprit was located in the mansion a short time after midnight and returned to the guest house before 1 a.m. Erica then returned from the bookstore's room with Nanjo, and therefore never noticed that George had left the guest house. So now we can move on to the cousin's room scenario. So here we have George, Jessica, Maria, and Rosa in the cousin's room. All of them are in a state of fake death and covered in fake blood. Special attention has been paid to faking wounds on their necks, so that to the untrained eye, it could have been seen as a lethal neck wound that, when being in an overly emotional state of shock, would have been regarded as incredibly gruesome and deep wounds, when in fact in reality their necks were completely intact. I don't know if George had already attacked Jessica and Maria before he went to the mansion or not, but it doesn't really matter. In the end, what would have to happen is the following. George attacked...
I don't know why we're not just saying that they were pranking Erica. They do the same thing in the very next game. So why couldn't they have just been pranking her?
Jessica, Maria, and Rosa in the cousin's room and made sure they were unconscious using the fake death drug. Using fake blood, it made it look like a murder scene. Then he faked his own death. Basically, the biggest deception throughout the fifth game is that the reader is led to believe that George, Jessica, Maria, Rosa, and Genji truly were dead. However, as became clear near the end of the trial, they could not have been dead, and this is proven with the red by showing that their bodies were never moved after they died. And since their bodies did disappear, which was confirmed by Erica, they could not have been dead before. It is of course stated in red that these people really were dead, that everyone looking at them could establish that. But these red statements are not made at the time that their supposed corpses were discovered, but were made at the end of the second day at midnight. But everyone having read the fifth novel would already know that. Especially the statement made by Vitilia was very sneaky because it was made quote-unquote underneath the game world, meaning outside of the time on game world, which was repeated for Battle because he joined in later. So the red truths regarding their deaths and that any person could establish their deaths were in fact about their bodies after the bomb had gone off. Also, all that was shown is that no one would mistake a dead person for a living person, but it doesn't mean that they couldn't mistake a living person for a dead person. In other words, none of the people in the cousin's room truly were dead, so that means that their necks weren't really sliced open either. That was merely an interpretation by people seeing corpses. After all, if you are in a state of emotional shock and you see blood on the necks of people you care for, it's not surprising if you would say something like, their necks were completely sliced open. Moreover, Erica's perspective is the objective perspective, and she never examined the corpses. The only person she heard from what state the corpses were in was Dr. Nanjo. After all, the family members covered up the victims so that only their faces were visible, but not their necks, and this happened before Erica walked into the room. She only could establish that there were people lying in the beds, but not what state they were in. She then asked Nanjo about the victims, and it was he who told her about their neck wounds. Now Nanjo would have realized that these people were not really dead, and that their necks very much were intact, but since he had George's accomplice, Dr. Nanjo lied to Erica about the state George, Jessica, Maria, and Rosa were in. Basically, throughout the fifth game, the question seems to be who could have entered the cousin's room to kill these people. But no one could have entered the room apart from Natsui, and she's not culprit as we know. Therefore, blue truth, the scenario in the cousin's room could only have been set up from the inside. In other words, the culprit had to be either Jessica, Maria, Rosa, or George. After all, at midnight, Erica left the cousin's room, and at that point, nothing had happened yet. The people were all alive, and there would have been no magic circle on the wall. And since no one could have entered the cousin's room till morning apart from Rosa, and of course Butler, but he wasn't involved as the writer established, the person who set up the scenario, including painting the magic circle on the wall, would have to have been one of the four people in the cousin's room. In other words, the only possible suspects for the fifth game were Jessica, Maria, Rosa, and George. One of them had to have been the one to set up the scenario. Another little hint that points towards George is that it was his watch alarm that woke up Butler in the morning. Since the culprit probably didn't catch the victims in their sleep, but before they went to sleep, it is plausible that the culprit was the one who set the alarm to make sure that Butler would wake to discover corpses. I believe that the magic circle was basically just a last-minute idea of George, which he painted in a hurry and didn't really do a good job on. After all, George doesn't care about the whole magic stuff in the first place. But given that he had delivered a seemingly magical letter from Beatrice, I think he did it in order to confuse people since the magic circle makes the scene a bit scarier. So this explains everything up until the discovery of the victims. But why exactly did George go for a fake death method for his victims rather than actually killing them? We cannot be sure of his exact reasons, of course, so we have to speculate a bit. But since he had to relocate 4 bodies all by himself, it would be quite difficult to carry them. It would be easier to have them being able to walk and relocate them on the thread using a gun. After all, there are tons of unchecked places where a gun could have been hidden, even if the cousin's room itself wasn't thoroughly checked. Also, if he faked the wounds of all of the victims, including himself, there would be no discrepancy between his own wounds and the wounds of the other victims. Where exactly George took Jessica, Rosa, Maria, and later on Genji, we cannot be sure of. But what basically must have happened is that after everyone left the guest house, George woke up the rest and relocated them on the thread and maybe even partially tied them up to another location and confined them there. Then he had to sneak to the mansion to make another phone call to Natsui. Then he killed Krause. Of course, he made sure to pour fake blood on Krause's bed to make it seem like he had been killed there. Then he woke up Genji and confined him somewhere as well. So Genji was then suddenly missing when Erica and the rest got to the waiting room. Of course, Nanjo had already lied about the state Genji was in, as Nanjo had seen Genji's supposed corpse, but Erica had not. Now, there might be an objection here regarding the time of Natsui's phone call, to which I would reply. Natsui received a morning phone call after the victims in the cousin's room were discovered, and the discoverers had left again. In other words, if for example Natsui received a phone call at 7:30 a.m. or later, then there is no problem with it being George's phone. It is impossible to prove at what time Natsui received the phone call. The only thing we know subjectively is that Koda again knocked on the door during the call, which means that this is after they discovered Genji's supposed corpse. Given that Koda was preparing breakfast before and was nearly finished, and the fact that breakfast was to be served at 8 a.m., we can be reasonably certain that Natsui's phone call occurred somewhere around 8 a.m. No matter what little evidence we have, that would be the most reasonable assumption. George ordered Natsui to hide herself in the closet of the guest room at 1 p.m. as part of his plan to frame her for murder. He probably had hoped that Bethel would take the fall for the victims in the cousin's room, but he could never have taken the appearance of Erica, let alone the fact that she would be listening the entire night for anything suspicious to happen in the cousin's room, which proved Bethel's innocence. Nevertheless, Natsui still took the fall for both the supposed murders in the cousin's room and the next murder in the guest room where Natsui was forced to hide in the closet. George had a bit of luck here because Bethel showed to Erica that it would have been possible for Kingsale to escape from the study, even though in fact he had been dead for 2 years already. So this gave Erica a possible candidate for someone to carry away the corpses. So around 1 p.m., Natsui hid in the closet of the guest room. Later on, Hideyoshi came into the room and stabbed Chain. Then he was murdered and a stake was stabbed in his back. Due to the screams, the other people were alerted, which resulted in Koda cutting the chain, and everyone burst into the room to find Hideyoshi dead in the bed. Then Erica came in after she checked the windows and the room were really dark, including the shutters. The room wasn't thoroughly searched apart from Koda looking in the bathroom section of the room, so Natsui wasn't discovered. Her presence was only proven much later when Erica discovered the blood and missing from her clothes in the closet. So I think that the threat to this murder is extremely simple, namely the following. George was hiding under the bed before Natsui came in. When his father entered the room, he killed him and hid under the bed again. Nobody looked under the bed, so he was never discovered. Since George was believed to be dead, no one suspected that he had ever been in the guest room in the first place. The only place that was checked was the bathroom, and Quotist saw that nobody was there. But even in the bathroom, that could have been a hiding spot that Quotist didn't notice. After all, Quotist's perspective is subjective. Only if Erica had checked the bathroom, we could have been certain that nobody had been hiding there. But since nobody looked under the bed, this would have been the most plausible hiding place. When I first read the scene, I actually expected it to be a trap murder, but since Erica never discovered any evidence of this, it seems to go against the rules to claim that it was an indirect murder by using a trap. I think that the fact that Hideyoshi was the victim was purely incidental. All it was needed was for someone to enter the guest room, and it just happened to have been his father, which probably was his least favorite victim. But nevertheless, he was willing to kill him in order to frame Matsui, who would never see his father again anyway. But now we hit a roadblock in the fifth game, because the game is basically suspended and we don't get to see what happens after Hideyoshi's murder. But what we do know is that at midnight, George and the others truly are dead, so something went wrong. But we can only speculate on what exactly went wrong, since we literally have no facts to go on, as we only see a few scenes in the parlor, and of course the magical trial. So what could have happened? Well, we have to speculate in any case. But since George had faked everyone's death apart from Kraus, it is possible that Rosa had been able to break free and retaliate by arming the bomb, killing everyone including George. Or George armed the bomb himself, but as I said before, he didn't know it would go off at midnight, so he unknowingly blew himself up as well. But whatever happened, we simply cannot know. So that concludes my explanation of the fifth game. Contrary to the first four games, when it comes to the official explanation, there really is no explanation about who the culprit was supposed to be in the fifth game, and I don't have a clue how believers in the official explanation would explain this game. Shikaran could not have been the culprit in the fifth game, and if she was supposed to be Beatrice, it was already unlikely that she was the culprit, since it's very much suggested that the person who Beatrice represents is the mastermind in the first four games, but not in the fifth game. So if you believe in the official explanation, you already need to invoke another person as culprit. Moreover, you are forced to believe that the culprit was one of the four people in Cousins' room, since that scenario had to have been set up from the inside. And in case of Hideyoshi's murder, the only people who could have been hiding inside the room, apart from Matsui, would be George, Jessica, Rosa, Maria, Kenji, or Kraus. But Kraus was confirmed to Red to be dead shortly after Matsui received a phone call. Also, this is showing Red that Kraus is not culprit, so he's on the list. Matsui is confirmed to Red to not be the culprit, and Genji is not a killer, as we know, due to the Red from the fourth novel. And Jessica didn't commit murder either, as we know from the third game. Maria is also an unlikely culprit for multiple reasons. First of all, because she believes in Beatrice, and second of all, that it would be difficult for her given her age, which limits her both physically and mentally. So that leaves only Rose and George as plausible suspects. In other words, the two culprits of my theory were the only plausible candidates in the fifth game to begin with, and it should be obvious why George is a far more likely suspect than Rosa in this particular game. Nevertheless, if anyone has an alternative explanation for the fifth game, then I would love to hear it.
I got one right here.
The fifth game began as a joke as well, meaning that it was all an act. However, that's a very implausible explanation. First of all, there is zero evidence that it was a prank, and there was literally nothing in the fifth game.
How is there zero evidence?
Remotely suggest this. Also, since the epitaph was sold, the family would have other things on their minds than playing a prank.
Would they?
But Erica. Moreover, in this game, the family isn't that annoyed by Erica in the first place. In fact, they are thankful that she helped to solve the epitaph. Also, given Natsumi's trial in the parlor, it wouldn't even begin to make sense that it was all a prank. So that explanation is just pretty much impossible. At least my explanation is possible, plausible, consistent, coherent, and elegant.
Okay, bro. That's just like your opinion, man. I mean, I guess you could prefer that theory for whatever reason, but I'm just not seeing it. I mean, here's the evidence that it was a prank. It would be hard for like 10 different people to mistakenly think that 5 people were dead when they weren't, right? That would be a very surprising turn of events. To me, that's bigger than any of these things, right? It's like human eyes are pretty good. They're much better than human minds. So it makes much more sense to me that people would do something a bit silly than that they would mistakenly think a bunch of people that weren't dead were dead.
It is especially elegant because I don't need to invoke some random person as a culprit in the fifth game, as there were 2 culprits to begin with. The only real problem was Natsumi's room being locked around midnight, but that objection is both unprovable and can be solved in multiple ways. So at this point, I've explained basically everything that needed to be explained regarding the 5th, 6th, and 7th novels. But there is just one little thing that I need to discuss first before I can go into the whodunit of the first 4 games. Namely, something that came up in the 5th novel, and also in real solutions to the first 4 games. Namely, the gold truth. This is going to be a very short chapter, but I need to discuss the gold truth since it appears at multiple places in real solutions to the first 4 games. So we have to know what the gold truth is before we can move on to the first 4 games. However, if you have read the 8th novel, you should already understand the gold truth since it was basically explained there. Nonetheless, I thought that it was already very clear what the gold truth was. First of all, there really only appear 2 gold statements which are the following. I guarantee that this course is usually near Pinzo's course, and you use magic to create a golden flower petal inside an overturned cup. It was a splendid bit of magic. Even though the gold truth is explained in the 8th novel, I myself, and I assume a lot of other readers, already figured out its meaning before finishing the story. Although I have also seen people who completely misunderstood it, and perhaps it wasn't really clearly explained in the 8th novel for people who actually misunderstood the gold truth before that. Basically, the first thing we need to realize is that something being stated in gold has no bearing on whether it is actually true or not. After all, the first statement we know to be true, but we also know that the second statement to be false since magic cannot exist, and the 2 Beatrices don't exist either. So that implies that something that is false can also be stated as gold truth. The second thing we need to realize is that when Bella used the gold truth, it was because he wasn't allowed to use the red truth. He had to show that things would lie using a human truth. So basically, we know that a gold truth is both subjective, it may or not be actually true, and it is a truth that humans are capable of producing. When Beatrice the Elder used the gold truth, it was about the trick with the opened cup with Beatrice the Younger, or Chick Beatrice. Basically, the two of them believe in magic, even though the trick with the opened cup really is nothing more than a sleight of hand. But both believe it to be magical. When it comes to Kinzo's corpse, it is burned beyond recognition. But because that's 6 toes just like Kinzo had, which is a rare condition, everyone accepted that it must be Kinzo's corpse. In other words, blue truth is something that could be true, red truth is something that is true, and gold truth is something that is believed to be true. Or as it's called in the 8th novel, it's a consensus among people. If all people involved accept that X is true, it becomes a gold truth. But X may or may not be true in reality. For example, let's say you are in a group of 6 people and you have a large box in your midst, which you cannot open. Let's say that one of you claims that there's an apple inside this box, and you give some reasons for believing that, and you all trust this person and see no reason to disbelieve this claim. Therefore, you all accept that there's an apple in this box. So the statement there's an apple inside the box would become a gold truth because it's believed to be true by all people involved. However,
Why? I accept that this is what it is, but why? Why include it? And does it solve the Kinzo thing in the 5th game? It doesn't make sense. It's just Rikishi being silly.
it doesn't mean that there really has to be an apple inside the box. That could still be false. In other words, the gold truth, there is an apple inside the box, and the red truth, there's no apple inside the box, are completely compatible. But to turn that around, the gold truth, there's an apple inside the box, and the red truth, there isn't even an apple inside the box, are completely compatible as well. The only thing that is required for a gold truth is that it is believed to be true by at least one individual, but not necessarily by one making the gold statement. However, that could be the case as well. In fact, apart from the gold truth used by Better, all other gold truths that appear in the story are in actuality not true. When it comes to Kinzo's burned corpse, we never have any confirmation on the island itself that it is Kinzo's corpse, other than the fact that it has 6 toes, which is the reason why everyone accepts that it is Kinzo's corpse. But it's not until the 5th novel itself that we actually know that it has to be Kinzo's corpse, because of the red statement that no corpses appear other than of the characters that have appeared in the story. So how can we translate that to the real world on the island? What probably happened in the 5th game is that Kinzo's corpse was eventually found, which went against Erika's theory that Kinzo was alive and carried away corpses. But everyone apart from her accepted that it was Kinzo's corpse due to the fact that it had 6 toes. So the whole family and the servants all agreed that this corpse was Kinzo, and therefore rejected Erika's theory that Kinzo could have carried away the corpses. Therefore, from the meta-world perspective, Beth could attack Erika with the gold statement, I guarantee that this corpse is Shinomiya Kinzo's corpse. And Erika had no choice but to accept that, even though in an ultimate sense, there was no definite proof that this corpse was really Shinomiya Kinzo's corpse. But still, Beth was able to defeat Erika using a human truth to show that Kinzo was dead, since he wasn't allowed to use the red truth, so he attacked Erika with a gold truth instead. Moreover, this shows that Beth had understood Beatrice and was now worthy of being a new game master, because the gold truth is essentially one of the powers of the golden beast Beatrice. Because there is in a sense a general gold truth throughout the story that is pressed on Battle to be believed, namely that magic exists and that the murders were carried out by a witch called Beatrice. And basically, Battle is trying to disprove that gold truth throughout the story. When it comes to Beatrice the Elder and Beatrice the Younger, the trick with the cup had already been demonstrated by Erika to be a simple trick. However, when the two Beatrices were alone in their own world and performed the trick, the consensus among them was that it was true, genuine magic and not a trick. Therefore, Beatrice the Elder said in bold that the other Beatrice truly used magic to create a flower petal inside the overturned cup. It was their own personal reality, so to say. Now you may say that there were only 2 gold statements made in the entire story. Well, that's true when it comes to direct statements, but the gold truth is also mentioned by Will in the 7th novel when he gives his solutions to how the murders were carried out in the first 4 games. That's why I needed to discuss the gold truth before explaining the first 4 games. After all, even though Will's solutions are not stated in red but in plain white text, I think it's unreasonable to assume that they can be false. After all, the whole point is that he understands Beatrice, and if his solutions can be false, then they serve no purpose whatsoever. So even though the 7th novel is written in order to deceive, it is about the way everything is phrased and not about the actual content itself. And regardless of Will's solutions not being read, so we can prove with absolute certainty that they are correct, I'm going to assume that Will indeed knows the truth and that his solutions are accurate, although somewhat ambiguous and open to interpretation, since they are all in sort of middle format. I also believe that Will's solutions are phrased in such a way that people believing in the official explanation will see his solutions as confirming that Shannon is the culprit, and also that she is the same person as Canon. And some of Will's solutions do indeed seem to suggest that. However, I will demonstrate that my theory actually fits just as well with his solutions, and in my opinion fit even better actually. So this is what most people will probably consider the most important part, the how done of Beatrice's games. So can the first 4 games be explained with Rose as the main culprit, George as the second culprit, and Dr. Nanjo as the single non-murdering accomplice? And does it fit Will's solutions? I will now demonstrate that I can explain all of the murders with just these 3 people, but not only that, I will also challenge the official explanation here and there, and demonstrate why my solutions with George and Rose as the culprits are superior to solutions with Chicanon as the culprit.
Oh man. Okay, well, I think as you can tell, I had some more disagreements in this one than I did in the last one. Most of them are not super consequential in terms of distinguishing between the different theories, but I still thought I should point them out just because, you know, if you're pointing this out as the ultimate theory that proves everything right, yada yada, want to make it perfectly clear, right, that this guy is not exactly using perfect reasoning at all times. I hope that even if you don't agree with all my objections, you can agree with that. But yeah, any other broad points I'd like to make about this? I don't think so. Yeah. I'll be curious to see the howdunnits for 1 through 4. Especially 3, because obviously my solution to the linked closed room murders is the most wackest solution I gave, right? and you seem disappointed by it. So I'm curious what solution he's gonna give, just because it's like, I mean, there has to be some kind of solution. So let's hear what it is. Let's hear what it is. I don't care about yo dang solution for the 5 people in the cousin's room who looked to be dead but weren't really dead. Like, do I really care if it was a prank or if people couldn't tell if they were alive or dead? Not really. It's stupid either way, but like everything about the 5th game is stupid, right? And my explanation that it's because Lambda Delta is trolling, right, makes a lot of sense. Whereas, you know, this explanation, not so much, but oh well. Oh well. Anyways, I'll see you next time.